Hello, students. This is Professor Lyons, and in this chapter, we're going to be talking about what goes on inside of the cells of living things. So I don't have any pictures of individual cells, but I do have this picture of a black macaque. So it is a type of old world monkey, and you can see old world monkeys such as this black macaque, in places like Africa, Asia, Southeast Asia. I took this picture in Indonesia. So all of the different things on this planet that are living are made up of either individual cells or multiple cells. And there's a couple of different ways that we can kind of group together those cells. So one way that we can do so is by grouping together cells as being prokaryotic or being eukaryotic. So prokaryotic cells are owned by things such as bacteria and archaea. So these are very, very simple types of single-celled living organisms. And that kind of goes with this picture here. So this is a picture I took a few years ago of what's known as the Grand Prismatic Pool in Yellowstone National Park out in Wyoming. And so this pool is super, super hot, filled with water. Why you see all these colors inside of it are types of prokaryotes that can live in those scalding hot waters. So they're what give these pools, pools such as this one, it's really blue centers and darker kind of reddish yellowish perimeters. So these are what you're seeing in this picture are individual cells, prokaryotes that are really colorful and very simple. Whereas all the other living things on this planet have eukaryotic cells. So things like protists, which we'll talk more about in a future lab, all of the plants, all of the fungi, the mushrooms and whatnot, and all of the animals such as us and such as this black macaque, all of these things have eukaryotic cells. So let's talk about the difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So first of all, in terms of age, prokaryotic cells have been around a lot longer than eukaryotic cells, right? So prokaryotes were the first living things on this planet. And there's evidence that those first living things date back to somewhere around 3.5 billion years ago, right? So they've been on the planet for quite a long time. Our Earth is somewhere in the order of 4.5 billion years old. And so the prokaryotes have been on this Earth almost as long as the Earth has existed. And then there are the eukaryotes. These first appeared on our planet somewhere around 2 billion years ago. So, so quite a while that they've been around, but not nearly as long as prokaryotes have. In terms of size, prokaryotic cells tend to be much smaller. Eukaryotic cells tend to be much larger. So with a typical microscope, you can see most eukaryotic cells. With prokaryotic cells, you need much more magnification power to be able to actually see them. If you look at the organelles, these are individual components of cells that carry out specific functions. Prokaryotic cells have very few, whereas eukaryotic cells have many. And we're going to talk in the later part of this chapter about those various organelles that occur inside of eukaryotes. Kind of the key thing that differentiates the two groups is what's known as a nucleus, which is a type of organelle. And the nucleus is what holds the DNA for eukaryotic cells. So like in the cells inside of your body, your cells, each one of those has a nucleus, and the DNA of that cell lives inside of the nucleus, right? So we have that, whereas prokaryotes such as bacteria, those things don't have a nucleus with DNA inside of them. So really in terms of like how simple or complex they are, prokaryotic cells, incredibly simple, eukaryotic cells, much, much more complex. And this makes sense in terms of the evolution of life on this planet. So in general, the way that things go is you start very simply and things get more and more complex over time, right? So the first life forms on this planet were incredibly simple prokaryotes, and they got more and more complex over time, and then eukaryotes evolved from the prokaryotes. So we're going to go on a sort of tour of the eukaryotic cell. So we're going to talk about what we see inside of plant cells and what we see inside of animal cells. And there's quite a lot of overlap between the two, but there are some differences between animal cells and plant cells. So we're going to talk about these various types of organelles that they have and what the function is of those various organelles. So first we're going to start with the outside. And so we'll start with what's known as the cell plasma membrane. So this encloses and protects the cells. So much like you have skin, which encloses and protects your innards, our individual cells have their own coverings on the outside that protect them and hold all their important bits in. And we think of the plasma membrane as being a fluid mosaic. So the fluid part of that means that molecules can move through it, right? So it's not a rigid thing that prevents anything from going in and out. It does allow things to go in and out, so it is fluid. The mosaic part refers to the fact that there is a bunch of proteins that are embedded within our plasma membrane. So what you see here, this kind of purplish thing and this greenish thing, these are proteins. And what a lot of those proteins do is they regulate traffic of molecules and things going in and out of the cells. So it might prevent certain things from going into the cell, but allow other things to go into the cell. So it kind of regulates what's going on there. So that's a really important thing that the plasma membrane does. So it allows certain things to go in and prevents other things from going in. So all cell plasma membranes are made of what's known as a phospholipid bilayer. And so this relates a little bit to what we talked about in the last chapter, right? So we talked about lipids, and we talked about these two terms right here. We talked about hydrophilic and hydrophobic. So you might remember from the last chapter, the hydro part refers to water, and phobic means fearing, and philic means loving. So hydrophobic means afraid of water. So what you see here, this gray thing and these two yellow things, that is one phospholipid. And we have this hydrophobic tail that wants to get away from water and this hydrophilic head that likes water. So what happens is we have this bilayer formed where all of the parts that are hydrophobic that don't want to be around water, they kind of face themselves inward to get away from the liquid that is out here and the liquid that is in here. Whereas the hydrophilic parts that like that water, they arrange themselves facing outward. So this part is outside touching the water that it likes, and this gray part here is outside touching the water that it likes. So the water fearing things are on the inside, the water loving things are on the outside. So that's what makes up the plasma membrane. And then, like I was saying before, we have all these proteins that are embedded within that phospholipid bilayer in order to regulate traffic going across the membrane. So plants have, in addition to the plasma cell membrane, plants have an additional covering on the outside known as the cell wall. And so this cell wall is made of cellulose. And so we talked about cellulose a little bit in the last chapter. We talked about how it is a type of sugar, and it's a rigid sugar that gives plants their structure. And so a plant doesn't have bones like we do. They don't get their structure from that. But what they do is by having tons and tons and tons of individual cells, and each of those cells having cellulose on the outside, all of that rigid cellulose is what gives a plant its three-dimensional shape and its three-dimensional structure. So it's only plants that have these. We don't have these. Our cells are squishy, whereas plant cells are rigid. And its function, pretty obvious, protecting the cell and giving shape to the plants, kind of like I was saying before. Another thing that they do is they kind of regulate water, and so they keep plant cells from absorbing way too much water. Because they are rigid, there's only a certain volume of stuff that can go inside, so that is going to put a limit on just how much water a plant cell can absorb. Okay, the next organelle that we're going to talk about is the nucleus. So the nucleus is really important because it's what we refer to as the control center of the cell. And why we refer to it in that way is because this is where the DNA is stored. So we learned in the last chapter that DNA stores information, and that information is used for making proteins. So why the nucleus is the control center of the cell is because all of the proteins that a cell makes that it needs in order to function, it needs its DNA in order to make those proteins, and the DNA resides within the nucleus. And so this DNA is stored in the form of chromatin, so long fibers of DNA that are all held together with proteins, which kind of act like glue. And all of this chromatin together, forms chromosomes. And as we talked about in the last chapter, us humans, we have 46 chromosomes in our genome. So this is where DNA gets created. Because our cells do have to make more DNA when our cells undergo reproduction. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the semester. So DNA is made inside the nucleus, and that DNA is what regulates what goes on inside of the cell. And so the nucleus does have an outer covering called a nuclear envelope. So inside of a nucleus is actually another type of organelle known as the nucleolus. And so this is where ribosomes are made. So we are going to talk a little in just a couple minutes about what ribosomes do. They do carry out a very, very important function, and they are produced in this nucleolus thing, which is inside of the nucleus. And on the nuclear envelope of the nucleus, we have these things known as nuclear pores, little holes inside of the nuclear envelope. And that's what allows for RNA, so that's ribonucleic acid, and bits of ribosome to leave the nucleus and go out into the fluid around them that's known as the cytoplasm. So that the fluid on the outside, the fluid that is inside of the cell, but kind of outside of the organelles that are within the cell, that's known as the cytoplasm. And so the nuclear pores inside of the nuclear envelope is what allows RNA and ribosomes to go out into the cytoplasm. So ribosomes, as I mentioned before, are really important, and they're made inside of the nucleolus. What ribosomes do is they either reside within the cytoplasm, and what they do is make proteins. So the general thing that ribosomes do is they make our proteins, right? So all of the really important proteins that we need, like insulin and hemoglobin and lactase, all of those proteins are produced at the ribosomes. So the ribosomes essentially take the information that is stored in the DNA, and they use that information in order to make that long sequence of amino acids that makes up a protein. So there are ribosomes that are just in the cytoplasm, and then there are ribosomes that are attached to either the nucleus or another organelle that we're going to talk about that's known as the endoplasmic reticulum. And we'll talk a little bit more about that organelle a little bit later. So there are ribosomes kind of in these different areas within the cells. And depending on where a ribosome is located, that's going to affect what type of proteins it makes. So there are some proteins that if they are just needed just within the cell, then that's going to be made by a ribosome that is just in the cytoplasm, that is floating around in the fluid within the cell. However, there are some proteins that need to be made that need to then go outside of the cell. So for instance, the cells that are making lactase, for example, right? So lactase is needed for breaking down lactose. So the cells that are making that lactose, they need that lactase to go outside of them so that they can get at that lactose that is, in our digestive tract, for instance. So the ribosome that is going to make lactase is more likely to be attached to the nucleus or to the endoplasmic reticulum. And that's what allows that product, that lactase, to be transported outside of the cell. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that happens in a minute. But the important thing here is essentially ribosomes make proteins, and some make proteins that stay within the cell, some make proteins that go outside of the cell, that are secreted by the cell. That's what that word secreted means. It means to exit the cell. And so we're going to go over this, what you see here, in a lot more detail later. But I did want you to kind of just get a kind of prequel to what we're going to talk about in chapter 10 and what's going on in terms of going from DNA to proteins. So we start with DNA. So we can tell it's DNA because it has two strands, like I taught you about in the last chapter. So DNA gets decoded into RNA, which is single-stranded. And that all happens within the nucleus. That's this purple thing. That RNA that is made from the DNA, it's so that RNA is like a copy of the DNA. It leaves the nucleus and goes out into the cytoplasm, where it then binds to a ribosome. We just learned that ribosomes are where proteins are made. So what that ribosome does is it takes this RNA and it takes that information that is stored in this RNA in the form of the four letters A, C, G, and U, and it takes those letters and it uses that information to make a protein that has a particular sequence of amino acids in it. So information is going from DNA to RNA to protein. And we're going to talk about these steps in a lot more detail when we get into chapter 10, right? So there's a process that's going on here in step 1 where we go from DNA to RNA, and then there's another process going on here in step 3 where we go from RNA to protein. So we're going to go over that in more detail, but I do want you to keep this in the back of your mind because this kind of relates to what we're talking about here, where you have a nucleus that contains DNA and RNA. RNA actually leaves the nucleus and then is used by ribosomes to make proteins. So we're going to talk now a little bit more about the endomembrane system. And so this is an inner membrane system. So the prefix endo refers to things that are inside of something else. And what this system does is essentially moves materials throughout our cells. It transports them and it changes them around. It modifies them. And it consists of a few different parts, right? So it consists of the nuclear envelope, right? So that's a membrane that is inside of our cells. And it consists of this endoplasmic reticulum thing that I mentioned a little bit before, and we'll talk about in more detail in a minute. It consists of the Golgi apparatus, which we'll talk about more later. It consists of lysosomes, which our cells have, but plant cells don't. It consists of vacuoles, of which there's a few types, some that plants have, some that both plants and us have. And it consists of these vesicle things that kind of connect all of these different parts to each other. So it connects them physically. And vesicles are essentially just little bubbles almost. They're like little bubbles of membrane that have stuff inside of them. And vesicles, you can kind of think of them as like little packages that like the UPS or FedEx might move around from place to place. And those packages, have products inside of them, and they're moved from, from say like factory to factory to factory to home. And so this is just showing all those various parts, right? So the nuclear envelope, we have ribosomes that are some on the fluid, or some in the fluid in the cytoplasm, that is, some that are on the surface of the nuclear envelope and of the endoplasmic reticulum, and then we have this Golgi apparatus stuff. So first we'll talk about the endoplasmic reticulum. We already talked about the nuclear envelope, so we're going to skip that. But the endoplasmic reticulum, what it does is it produces a whole bunch of different types of molecules. And there are two types. There is rough endoplasmic reticulum. It's called that because it has ribosomes on its surface. And what it does is it produces, with the help of the ribosomes that make proteins, right? So it is making proteins with ribosomes, and those proteins are then transported by vesicles to different parts of the cell or transported to the outside of the cell. Then is smooth endoplasmic reticulum, and these are in charge of making enzymes specifically. So you might remember that enzymes, that's one of the types of proteins that are used for helping chemical reactions go along. Smooth endoplasmic reticulum also is used for making lipids. And so how this might work is, say we have some rough endoplasmic reticulum here. We know it's rough endoplasmic reticulum because it has a ribosome attached to the outside of it. So that ribosome makes a protein that is then inside of the rough ER. That protein is then put into one end of a chamber of rough endoplasmic reticulum. That chamber then kind of pinches off and now essentially becomes a transport vesicle. And so that transport vesicle can then be moved to another part of the cell, or it can be moved to the plasma cell membrane, in which case this protein might get pushed to the outside of the cell, where it might be used outside of the cell. So you can kind of think of this, think of what's going on here. This is kind of like a factory, right? So you have the ribosome and it's attached to this factory where this protein is getting made. That's the product that the factory is making. That protein then gets put inside of a package, and then that package, which is this vesicle thing, then gets transported to another part of the cell or transported out of the cell. So then the Golgi apparatus, it behaves in a pretty similar way to the endoplasmic reticulum, but not quite. It's a little bit different. And so it kind of works with endoplasmic reticulum, but what essentially does is it receives transport vesicles from rough ER. The materials that are inside of that ER then goes into the Golgi apparatus. So it receives those products, it changes them around, binds them together or breaks them apart. So it changes them around, it stores them inside for a while, and then finally it redistributes those products. So a transport vesicle will come in on one end, the products that were inside of that vesicle get stored and modified in the Golgi apparatus, and then they leave out another end and then get sent somewhere else, either inside or outside of the cell. So it's kind of like another factory that kind of transports things around. And this is kind of how a lot of products are made. Most things aren't just produced in one factory. Like a car, for instance, is made up of a whole bunch of different parts that are made in a whole bunch of different factories. Those various parts are then all assembled together in one particular factory and then shipped out. So there might be a factory where, say, tires are made. Those tires are then sent to a central factory, which in this case would be the Golgi apparatus, and that would be like, say, like a Ford factory in Detroit, Michigan. Inside of the Ford factory, then all of those individual parts are all put together, and then a whole completed car is sent out, out to the Ford dealerships throughout the U.S. and worldwide. So you can think of the ER, the endoplasmic reticulum, it's like a factory that makes a part of a car. And then the Golgi apparatus is like the factory that puts together all of those parts of a car to make a whole complete car. Okay, another piece of endomembrane system I want to talk about is animal cell lysosomes. So what these do is they break down food. Right, so lysosomes are these sacs of enzymes that attach to what are known as food vacuoles. Right, so our cells, they consume things just like we do. Right, so here's a little bit of food that came from something that you ate. It goes inside of the cell through a food vacuole. A lysosome attaches to it. And these enzymes that are things that, as we talked about before, they're proteins that help chemical reactions take place. They bind onto this food and they break it down, they digest it, so that then your cell can then take the energy that is stored inside of this food and use it to do the things that it needs to do. And so only animal cells have these because animals, meaning us, we eat things. Plants don't have these because plants don't consume things. So we have lysosomes, plant cells do not. Okay, a vacuole is another type of, or another part of the endomembrane system. And so these are large sacs of membrane. And they function in a few different ways. So they can be used in the terms of food vacuoles, like we just discussed in the last slide. They can move food around the cell of an animal. In the case of what's known as a protist, which you'll learn about a little bit later on, so protists are very simple types of eukaryotes. There are these contractile vacuoles, things that pump out too much water. So if they get too much water inside of them, these contractile vacuoles will pump that water out. In a way, kind of like how we pee out water when we have too much of it. And then in the case of plant cells have these things known as central vacuoles, which is a kind of storage place for nutrients that the plants need, and it's a place where they can store water that they need. Okay, so there's just a few more types of organelles I want to talk about. Two of the organelles that we're going to talk about in the rest of this chapter have to do with energy in the harnessing or extracting of energy. And those two different types of organelles kind of relate to these two pictures. So I think probably a lot of you can tell that this is a picture of some solar panels. So that's kind of similar to one of the organelles we'll talk about. And what you see over here is a generator. And so this is kind of like another type of organelle that we will talk about. And so cells have to convert energy from the environment into forms that the cell can use. Right, so we talked about in chapter 1 how one of the important properties of life is that we take energy from the environment around us and we use that energy for our own means. However, the energy that is in the environment around us is not always in the format that our cells can use. So actually the energy that is stored in our food, say in the sugar that we ingest, we can't use that energy directly. We actually have to convert that energy into another form that our cells can use. In plants, they take energy from the sun and they use that for the things that they need. But plants can't use that energy from the sun directly. They have to convert it into another type of energy. And so that's kind of like what's going on with these two different things, right? So what solar panels do is they take solar energy and they convert it into electrical energy. And what a generator does is it takes energy in the form of gas and it converts that into electrical energy. So what these two organelles do, which is the chloroplast and the mitochondria. So chloroplasts are like the little solar panels inside of plant cells, and mitochondria are like the little generators that you find both in animal cells and in plant cells. What these two organelles do is essentially convert between different types of energy. So chloroplast takes energy in the form of sunlight and convert it into energy in the form of sugars. What the mitochondria does is it takes energy in the form of sugars and it converts it into another type of energy that our cells can actually use. So chloroplasts are where photosynthesis occurs, which we're going to talk about in a lot more detail in chapter 7. But what you really just need to know now is that photosynthesis is converting light energy coming from the sun or coming from, say, a light bulb if you're growing a plant indoors. And is taking that energy and converting it into the chemical energy of sugar. Right, so photosynthesis is a very important part of life on this planet, because we rely on sugars, and where we get those sugars from is from plants. Because we either eat plants that have those sugars that come from photosynthesis, or we eat animals that eat those plants. So we get sugar from the animals that we eat, and those animals got sugar from their plants. Or we eat animals that eat animals that eat plants, or we eat animals that eat animals that eat animals that eat plants, or so on and so forth. Essentially, all the sugars that we consume, if you go back far enough, they come from plants. And how those plants made them is with photosynthesis. So life on this planet would be very, very different without plants and without photosynthesis. We would not exist if it wasn't for this. So these little chloroplast things are very, very important to our lives. And I think this kind of goes without saying, chloroplasts are only found in plant cells. So plants are able to do this, to take light energy and make sugars from it. We are not. You cannot just go stand out on the sidewalk and take your clothes off and absorb energy from the sun through your body. You can't do that because first of all, you get arrested for shit like that, but also you just can't do that because you don't have chloroplasts inside of your body. So don't try that. Don't try that at home. Mitochondria are a type of organelle that we do have, however. So this is the site of what's known as cellular respiration. So this is how our bodies take energy from the food molecules that we consume and convert it into something known as ATP, which we're going to talk a lot more about when we get into chapter 5 and chapter 6. So essentially our bodies and the bodies of plants or any other living thing on this planet can't just take energy from food and use it directly. So right now, your body is not directly using the energy from the food that you ate for breakfast or lunch or dinner or whatever. What your body is doing is you are using mitochondria to take that energy that is in that food and changing that into the form of ATP, which is the form of energy that your body can actually use. So these are very much like little generators, like I talked about, right? So they're taking energy in the form of food. A generator takes energy in the form of gas and converts it into something else. Mitochondria converts it into ATP. Generators take that gas energy and convert it into electricity. So like I was saying, ATP is the direct energy source that cells use. So cells don't use sugars, they don't use proteins, they don't use lipids, they use ATP. Okay, another part of the cell that I want to talk about is what's known as the cytoskeleton. So this is within the cytoplasm, and what it essentially is a whole bunch of fibers. Fibers that are known as microtubules. So micro meaning small, tubule meaning a tube. So they're really tiny, tiny, tiny little tubes that are inside of the cells. And so all of these, fibers, they are what give the cells some of its shape and some of its structure. Right, so plant cells don't need these quite as much because they have their rigid cell wall, but our animal cells do need this because they need it to have that structure because they don't have a rigid cell wall. So what they do is they give support to the cells so that they're what kind of gives a cell its shape. And you can kind of think of them as like beams or wood or like plywood or 2x4s that make up a building, right? So they're what give a cell its shape, just like a beam or a 2x4 is a piece of wood is what gives a building its shape and its support. Okay, finally, two last types of or parts of a cell that I want to talk about are what are known as cilia and what are known as flagella. So these are what are used for movement, either for moving individual cells, or if it happens to be a cell that is stuck in place, it's used for moving things, inside of a multicellular organism. So a flagella is a whip-like little bit of a cell. So what you see here, this is what's known as a euglena. It's a single-celled type of protist, and it has this little whip-like thing that it kind of, by beating this thing back and forth, it pushes the euglena through the water, and so euglenas, maybe don't matter to us that much, but this is an important part of how we reproduce. Right, so sperm cells have flagella on them, and that's how they swim and find the egg cell that allows for reproduction to occur. Cilia, which is a whole bunch of individual hairs, If one individual cilia is called a cilium, and a bunch of them together is called cilia. And so these are typically shorter, and there's a lot of them. So there's a whole bunch of cilia. So this is what's known as a paramecium, and it has a bunch of cilia on its covering. And these are like little, they're almost kind of like little oars of a crew team that are that are pushing a boat through the water. So all of these individual little oars are kind of beating back and forth, and that's what pushes pushes this paramecium through the water. You find cilia in parts of our body. So, for instance, inside of our lungs, we have cilia. And what that cilia does is it kind of moves around the fluid that is inside of our lungs. So they're very, very, very important to us. Okay, so that is the end of this chapter. Don't worry about this Socrative thing that I'm talking about here. But in the next chapter, we're gonna talk a little bit more about some of the processes that go on inside of our cells.